the Story Girl, and welcome to the story of Hansel and Gretel. This is the story about a man who had two wonderful children. The boy's name was Hansel, and the girl's name was Gretel. But, sadly, their mother had passed away many years before, and he had recently met a woman that he decided would fulfill his and his children's needs. And so, he married her. Unfortunately, the father was not a wealthy man. He worked hard every day chopping wood and working in the fields to scrape even a small amount of food for his family. In fact, he made so little money that it wasn't enough for him to work alone. His second wife had to work as well. But even then, there wasn't enough for 4 people. Well, that's what the stepmother said anyway. Darling, there just isn't enough money to buy enough food for the entire family. We are all practically starving. If there was just a few less people in this family, then we'd get along very well. A few less people, said the father. What do you mean? The children have to go. The children? Now you have to understand, Hansel and Gretel's father was a kind, soft-hearted man who loved his children more than any other thing. But the woman he had married was hard, spiteful, and selfish. Yes, they're old enough to be on their own. We should take them into the forest and leave them there. And I'm sure they'll get along on their own. They're old enough to strike out on their own in the world. They're just children, said the father. But the stepmother nagged and bullied and kept mentioning it until finally one night the father agreed. There was so little money and so little food. The children would have to go. The stepmother and the father made a plan. Well, what the stepmother and the father didn't know was Hansel and Gretel were so hungry they couldn't sleep. They heard the entire conversation. Gretel was silently weeping in their bed, but Hansel said, "Don't worry, Gretel. I'll take care of us." And he went out through the back door and crept out into the moonlit night. It was a full moon that night, and he looked down on the ground and saw that there were beautiful white shining pebbles on the ground. He scooped up as many as he could carry and stuffed them into his pockets. The next day, Hansel and Gretel were woken up quite early and each handed a crust of bread and told to follow their parents into the forest. They walked and they walked for miles until their feet were quite weary. And when they started to moan and they started to feel uncomfortable, the stepmother and the father built a fire for the 2 children and told them to wait there until evening, and they would come to fetch them. The children waited and waited, and the fire died down. They waited and waited, and Gretel fell asleep. They waited and waited till the moon was rising. They both woke and looked around and saw that it was quite dark, and Gretel began to cry. "Hansel, how will we find our way home?" "Don't worry, Gretel," said Hansel. "I will take care of you. While we were walking here, I was secretly dropping a stone by the path, and the moon is nearly rising. We will be able to find our way back to the house." And just as he said it, the moon burst out in full light, and they could see a path of small white shining stones. They followed it all the way back to their father's cottage. They knocked on the door, and the father opened it and was overjoyed to see his son and little daughter. He had been horrified by his action and cut to the core with his guilt. He hadn't been able to sleep all night. Well, the stepmother looked out upon the children and said, "Oh, you naughty children! How did it take you so long to get back to the house?" But inside she was saying, "Thought we were rid of them. Have to find another plan." For a moment, things went very well. Next few weeks, they got along as well as they'd ever done before, but the stepmother started to nag the father again. We cannot keep the children. If we keep them, we will all starve to death. None of us will be saved. We must take them deeper into the forest. Deeper into the forest. Yes! Deeper into the forest! Well, the husband didn't want to, but the stepmother nagged and worried him and fretted and talked and talked and talked until finally he agreed. Once again, Hansel and Gretel overheard the plan. Not to worry, thought Hansel. I'll just get more stones. However, when he went to the back door, he found it was locked. There was no way for him to get out and gather more stones. He went back to bed and was woken quite early. Another crust of bread shoved into his hand, and he and Gretel were shepherded along deeper, deeper, and deeper into the forest. But every so often, Hansel would stop, take off a few crumbs from his bread, and sprinkle them on the ground. It wasn't much, but it was the only thing he had. Once again, they stopped when they're at the very center of the dark forest. And the father and stepmother built a large fire for the children, told them that they should wait by the fire and that their parents would be back to fetch them before it was dark. Hansel and Gretel knew they would not be back for them. But they held out hope that perhaps, maybe, just maybe, they had had a change of heart. They waited by the fire. They waited and waited and waited. It became evening. Waited and waited and waited, and it became dark. And Gretel looked at Hansel. Hansel said, Gretel, I couldn't get any stones this time, but I dropped a little crumb of bread as often as I was able. I hope the trail is still there. They walked back along the path, but they could see the breadcrumbs were all gone. They'd been eaten by birds and woodland creatures during the day. And now they had nothing to do but try to find their own way. Don't worry, Gretel, said Hansel. I'm sure I'll be able to find the way. And they walked all night, but they couldn't find the right path. They walked all the next day, and they couldn't find the way home. All they had left to eat was a few berries that they had found. They walked and they walked and they walked until they were both weeping with tears down their face, stomachs growling in hunger, feet about to drop off from weariness, when Hansel saw something in the distance. A house. Not an ordinary house. Gretel, he said, look at that house. And Gretel raised her red puffy eyes and said, it looks like it's made out of gingerbread. Gingerbread. And they both bolted towards the house and found that indeed the entire building was made of rich, gooey gingerbread and was frosted with all kinds of lovely buttercream, and that there were chunks of sugared candy set among it like jewels. They immediately set to and began to feast upon the house, taking a bit of frosting and a bit of wall and stuffing it into their faces, when they heard a very old, rickety voice say, nibble, nibble like a mouse. Who is nibbling at my house? Abruptly, they both stopped eating and turned and saw the oldest, crookedest, most bent woman they'd ever seen, with a long nose and a long chin and scraggly gray hair, coming towards them using a cane. Ah, children, she said, come in. Don't eat the house. Eat the dinner that I have prepared for you. The old woman led them into her cottage, and, as she had promised, laid out was a beautiful meal, and Hansel and Gretel ate. They ate until their tummies were quite full, And then the old woman pointed them towards a corner of the cottage, and they saw 2 little beds, just the right size for 2 little children. Oh, they fell asleep immediately, fell asleep with full stomachs and peaceful hearts. When Hansel woke, he saw that he was no longer in the little bed. He was no longer inside the cottage. He looked around and saw he was inside of a cage just big enough for one little boy, out in the yard. He looked around and cried, "Help! Gretel, help! Be quiet!" said the witch. "Be quiet, you. Being angry will spoil your flavor." "Girl!" she cried out, and Gretel jumped up from the bed she was sleeping in and looked around. "Girl, go and make up a bunch of food for your brother here. He will fatten up quite nicely, and then I will have a feast to eat." Gretel cried. She sat down on the floor and sobbed. She tried throwing a fit, but the witch only smacked her with her cane and boxed her around the ears and said, "You do what I say, or it will be worse off for you." So what else could poor little Gretel do but start to cook? She baked loaves of bread and made porridge and took it out to her brother, and her brother ate. Every single day, the witch would hobble over to the cage in the yard and say, "Boy, extend your finger. Let me feel if you're fat enough yet." And Hansel, who was an extremely clever boy, extended not his finger, but a chicken bone that he had found in his cage. He extended it just enough, and the witch, with very poor eyesight, would look at it and pinch it. Not fat enough yet! And she would hobble back into the house and shout for Gretel to make more food. This went on and on and on for days, until finally one day the witch pinched the chicken bone that she thought was a finger and said, "Enough! I will eat you fat or thin." "Girl!" she cried to Gretel, "heat up the fire in the oven. There's going to be a feast tonight." Gretel didn't know what to do. She piled up as much wood as she could find to the fire, lit the fire till it was blazing and hot, and the witch hobbled over and said, "Girl, I don't know if that oven is hot enough. Check it for me. Stick your head in there so you can tell if it's hot enough." But Gretel knew that if she stuck her head in that oven, she would be the feast that night. "Sorry, ma'am," said Gretel. "I'm not sure how. Could you show me?" "Oh, you lazy pig," said the witch. "It is easy enough. You just stick your head in like this." And the witch hobbled over and stuck her head into the oven, and Gretel, in a moment of very quick thinking, pushed the old woman into the oven and slammed the door shut. It was over. The old witch was dead. Gretel couldn't believe it. She ran out into the courtyard and unlocked the cage that held little Hansel, and they danced together in the sunlight. They went back to snack on a bit of the house, and they saw that in the corner of the house, a large chest. They opened it up and saw that it was filled with golden coins, with jewels, and with many precious things. "You see this, Gretel?" said Hansel. "We'll never be hungry again with this." And they stuffed their pockets full of the coins and the precious gems. And they made their way back out into the forest. Somehow, after several days, and as much careful wandering as they could manage, they found their way to the edge of the forest and found the road that led to the cottage where their father and stepmother lived. "Father, Father, "Father!" they shouted as they ran up the path, and the door opened, and there stood their father, unkempt hair, eyes puffy and red, looking as though he had been through the most torturous week of his life. "Children," he said, "could it really be you?" "Father!" And they embraced him, and he couldn't believe that he was not dreaming until they had touched his face with their dear little hands and spoke his name again and again and again. "Never again," he said. "I'll never let go of you again. Your stepmother was an evil woman. I sent her away. I searched the forest for days, but I couldn't find you. I thought you must be. Here you are." "It is all right, Father," said Hansel. "Look what we have brought." And they pulled from their pockets handfuls of gems and coins and precious things. And they lived very happily forever after. The end. I'm the Story Girl, and I want to thank you for joining the story today. If you were thinking that you're not a storyteller, maybe you have a hard time telling stories and you're not really joining this story, I assure you, you are. What I want you to think about is, every time you hear a story, you're hearing it differently than any other person in the world. Think about the story of Hansel and Gretel. Who do you think was older, Hansel or Gretel? What color was the stepmother's hair? What kind of clothes did the witch wear? Your mind put all of those details into the story. And that is why I say, thank you for joining the story. If you like this story and you enjoy our world of stories, please subscribe. Please like and share this video so that I can continue making more videos and more stories to share with everybody. Thank you very much. Bye.